Now like to turn to our first panel discussion of the conference today on the role of food and farming in tackling the climate crisis, a broad topic, lots of scope for discussion. We've had a lot of food for thought, I think, from our participants so far. So for this panel discussion, I would like to welcome Christopher Atkinson, who is a board member at the EU's Organics Association, IFOAM, and head of standards at the Soil Association. We also have with us Green MEP Tilly Metz, who sits on a number of relevant committees in the European Parliament, including the ENVI committees, is also chair of the ANIT committee. We also have with us Nick Jacobs, who's director of the International Panel of Experts on Sustainable Food Systems, or IPES-Food, where he leads IPES-Food's work on the common food policy for the EU and agroecology. And I'd also like to welcome back to the discussion Helen Harwatt of the Chatham House. So welcome everyone to the discussion. I'd like to kick off the panel session today with some opening remarks from each of you on the information that was presented so beautifully by Helen earlier to do with the Chatham House studies. So these findings really illustrate how current food systems impact biodiversity loss and climate change. A very broad question to kind of warm you up with. What changes do you see are the highest priority to mitigate these issues in your opinion? So I'll give you each 5 minutes to respond to this. So firstly, maybe I can come to Tilly for your opening remarks on this.
Thank you very much, Natasha, for giving me the floor. Happy to be with us, with you, during this time. So let me point out, indeed, different measures of changes that would really help to mitigate and to fight biodiversity loss and also climate change. First of all, it's clear that we have to reduce chemical pesticides and herbicides, which is heavily impacting ecosystem and our natural resources. They kill pollinators and the species depending on them, they pollute water, etc. Secondly, it's also important to reduce the use of fertilizer. It has heavy impact on soil, waters, and ocean, and leads to acidification. And the production, a lot of people forget about that, but the production and use of fertilizer is also very climate heavy, so we shouldn't forget that. And thirdly, we should definitely stop monocultures. We need diversity on our fields. We need crop rotation that can allow the soil to recover, especially nitrogenous fixing crops, which are good for the climate on top of that. So it would really be a win-win situation. And then we need to stop intensification of food production. We need to promote and support a diverse and non-intensive production system. For animal production, it is essential ties a number of animals to the natural boundaries of the territory. So that means not more than 1.4 cows per hectare, for example. And fifthly, we need to reduce land use and give space back to nature. We need sanctuaries for nature in every territory and even on every farm. We need to give at least 10% of farmland back to nature. But now in the context of the Common Agricultural Policy reform, which is currently still being discussed, it seems we will get 5% at most. So globally, we are already using too much space, land and oceans, and the reservoirs of untouched biodiversity are shrinking at a drastic rate. Once they are gone, it is not that easy to restore and rewild spaces. A good example is, of course, the rainforest in South America. It is being eaten up by the production of animal products, directly by creating space for cattle to graze, or indirectly by the production of feed to be exported, of course, also to Europe. You all know that. Destroying the lungs of our planets for a steak on our plate, that it is about. So we do really also need strong due diligence rules for all imported products, especially when it comes to deforestation. And then just let me make a final remark, because some people then say to me, okay, you want to use the land more extensively and you want to use less land. And then people come, and how will you then feed everyone on this world? But the solution is really there, and it was mentioned just before, to switch to a more plant-based food system. Producing plant-based food is way more efficient when it comes to land, when it comes to water use, and it has a lower climate impact. So we need to definitely at least rebalance animal and plant productions in a way so that we can produce enough food for everyone without compromising our environment and our biodiversity in the long run. So that's for me for the first reaction to your question, Natasha. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tilly. Perhaps Nick, I will come to you now for your opening remarks on reflections on what we've heard so far.
Thanks very much, Natasha. Great to be here with everyone today. So even though I've only got 5 minutes, I'm going to try to talk about what we do need and what we don't need. First of all, I think it's worth noting that there is incredible consensus now on what the problems are, and to put it simply, industrial agriculture. And I think the report from Chatham House adds to many other excellent recent contributions to that debate. I would also then highlight that there is growing consensus about what solutions we need, certainly among a wide range of civil society organizations, scientific groups, international bodies, and farming organizations. And that consensus is saying that we do not need to just tweak the system, we need a fundamental paradigm shift. We need to reorient the system around a new set of principles. People refer to them in a variety of ways. My organization, IPES-Food, talks about diversified agroecological systems. The key point here is that we need diversity at the field level, the farm level, the landscape level. We need to combine different varieties, breeds, species within our farming systems in a way that rebuilds the health of the soil, fights pests, creates fertility, and builds resilient and secure livelihoods for farmers. These agroecological systems are based on circularity. They're close to the original principles of organic, or what I've heard referred to as organic 3.0. And crucially, these are systems that are productive because the soil is healthy, because they benefit from a thriving ecosystem with pollinators and other ecosystem services, and because they're resilient to the many shocks that we face and will continue to face in the future. Concretely, this means polyculture systems, agroforestry, mixed crop livestock systems, and a variety of other types of agroecological systems. So there's growing consensus, I think, on that direction of travel, but there's also lots of contestation. And this is where I'd like to talk about the changes we don't want and the ones that we should be really wary of at this juncture. Because I think if the battle has been won to define what the problems are, there's another battle that's underway right now to really define what ecological agriculture is and which transformation we're going to have. And the first risk is that we opt for simplistic silver bullet solutions that don't really address the problems we face, or maybe they address one problem while exacerbating other problems. These may be solutions that introduce new words, new technologies, or new actors into food systems, but without changing the fundamental logic, without changing the power relations, and therefore without being transformative in the long run. And to give some concrete examples, precision agriculture is one of the most heavily promoted solutions right now, particularly at EU level. And this is really about digitizing agriculture, bringing in drones and other digital technologies. And clearly there are some benefits to be had in terms of specific impacts. We may be able to reduce the use of chemical inputs on certain highly intensive farms through precision technologies. But these are technologies that lock farmers into production of uniform crop commodities on a large scale. They lock in monocultures. They lock in the requirement in high money investments. So this is not necessarily transformative. Another example is corporate-led sustainability schemes. And we're seeing an explosion of new labels and standards, particularly around regenerative agriculture or a version of it. General Mills in the US has pledged, I think, to source from regenerative agriculture on a quarter of all land it uses in North America by 2030. Similar pledges being made by European companies. Again, there could be some specific short-term benefits as some of the most intensive farms adopt new practices under these schemes. But at the same time, this is a type of solution that's reinforcing the power of big retailers, big processors. And we know that one of the big problems we're facing in food systems is that these big companies have too much power to set the terms, set the prices in food systems, and farmers are not even able to break even sometimes, let alone be able to invest in transitioning to sustainable practices. Alternative proteins are another interesting solution set I won't go into now for the sake of time. But the key point is that there are these kind of simplistic solutions everywhere, and we shouldn't underestimate the capacity of our current industrial systems to adapt and rebrand themselves as this debate unfolds. Of course, the transformation we need towards diverse agroecological systems requires innovation, and it requires technology. So the real question is, how do we get those innovations without creating new path dependencies? And how do we shift to sustainable diets without replacing one industrial system with another industrial system? How do we do all this in a way that empowers farmers and empowers people to take agency over their diets, so that we're really paving the way for a transformation in the longer term? And I've got ideas on specific things we could do, but I'll stop there for the sake of keeping to 5 minutes.
We'll come back to the ideas. You raise a number of really interesting points there, so I definitely want to hear more from you on the specifics of this later. But firstly, let me turn now to Christopher. Christopher, for your opening remarks, please. Chris, I think you are on mute. Sorry. Yeah, there we go.
No longer on mute. Thank you, Natasha, and thank you for the opportunity to join this very interesting workshop and conference. So it's a very hard act to follow Helen, and Tilly and Nick have obviously covered a huge amount of ground as well, but obviously I'm here as a representative of the organic movement, the organic sector. But I would like to go to emphasize the deep thinking that's gone into the development of organic farming, and the fact that it's based on a set of principles, and those principles are very much around producing a farming system which deals with complexity of natural ecological systems. And I think that the long-term solutions that we're looking for are much more about dealing with complexity and complex systems. A lot of the problems that we see within farming and food systems at the moment are a result of trying to simplify and perhaps oversimplify our approach to farming and food. And I think that organic farming and organic solutions offer a way of addressing and dealing with that complexity. But as we've heard, it's not just about the agricultural production systems alone. We do need that kind of push-pull approach to solutions that we need at the moment. And that would appear to be one of the biggest challenges. It's very easy to focus on the production side and to analyze and see and say what's wrong with farming. But if we are going to solve the problems that we face, we have to have all of society to commit to those. And organic principles and the organic standards that we have at the moment do offer some steps along the way to that, but there's a much bigger picture to address, and the societal involvement and the ability of citizens and the empowerment of citizens to help address our problems seems to be one of the great unanswered questions. Obviously, this kind of event can be helpful in deriving those solutions, but we have to be careful that we don't develop some sort of echo chamber. As Nick says, a lot of solutions are well identified and well known at the moment. One of the big challenges we have is to communicate those solutions and empower citizens to make the right choices. The organic movement tries to engage citizens, and individual organisations within the organic movement do that. But we need this to happen at much bigger scale and much more urgently. And obviously politicians like Tilly have a tremendous role to play in this. And so I think that, as I said earlier, dealing with complexity and embracing complexity is something that we need to do to find solutions. But that complexity needs to be communicated and understood, and people need not to be afraid of it. And we won't find solutions unless we get that engagement from wider society.
Absolutely. This need for complexity at the same time, as Nick highlighted, that, increasingly moving towards often silver bullet kind of simple solutions. So how to square this circle, very interesting. Thank you. And lastly, but definitely not least, let me turn to you, Helen. Maybe some reflections on what we've heard so far from the other panelists, just for a few opening remarks, 2 to 3 minutes.
Thanks, Natasha. Yeah, really, really interesting remarks, and I'd love to get further information on many of those points that were raised. Obviously, in our report, we laid out those 5 key levers of food system transformation and really tried to emphasize that food systems approach, which is absolutely essential to take in these, the system level rather than just any one particular element from that. But I think also some of the points that's been made by the speakers and when Chris said towards the end is creating food systems that really work for people and nature and climate. And I think that's a really key aspect to enabling the change on the level that we need to, really kind of broadening this out to a sort of collective, not necessarily a collective solution, but a collective understanding of the issues and enabling that engagement from society that we really need to have on these issues, rather than just kind of leaving it to a very small group of people in the world to take this and deal with it or not, which is kind of what we have at the minute. We really need to bring in participation from society, and in doing that, increase their access to healthy and sustainable food, increase their education and knowledge on food systems. And these issues really just kind of go together and just really need to be brought into that solution space. I don't think we can just keep leaving this to policymakers or corporations. It really needs to be broadened out.
Excellent. Okay, well, thank you very much. Well, let's kick off with the discussion then today. So Tilly, coming to you first. I mean, there's this strong focus at the moment on organic. We have the Organic Action Plan, the Farm to Fork strategy. There's a strong focus on plant-based, even in the EU Beating Cancer Plan and in other places. Is there enough focus on plant-based organic, in your opinion? How do we make that distinction, and how can these policies help gear towards more plant-based and organic production?
Yeah, so discussing the role of more plant-based organic farming, it really shows if we do this transition, this shift, it can show, and it was so well explained by Axel Anders, it shows you don't need animals to farm and to produce food. Vegan organic farming, because you use less fertilizer, tend to be very balanced and biodiversity rich system. And so it's also low inputs in terms of chemicals, of course, organic without chemicals. And this also conducts to less dependency for farmers on big companies. So there's another positive effect of that. So it really creates also new and healthy jobs. So that would be another win if we do this shift, this transition towards sustainable food system, which should be done plant-based and organic.
So let me come to you, Christopher, as the authority on all things organic here during this panel. As Tilly just said, we don't need animals to produce food. And I think this was a dilemma raised by Axel. And I'd really like to hear your input on this. What's your comment on this? Is this possible? Is this, we hear so often we need animal input for the fertilization of crops. What is your take on this?
Yeah, this is a good and really interesting question, of course. the role of livestock is something that should always be under consideration and reconsideration. And so, as I said earlier, the approach within organic is to emulate natural systems to some extent. Most natural systems do include livestock or animals of some kind within them. And perhaps one thing that we haven't really spoken about is the extent to which people might be seen as livestock within an organic production system, which is quite a difficult area at the moment. We don't allow sewage sludge to be used in organic farming at the moment. There are a lot of really complicated reasons why that's the case. But I'll just put that one out there for us to think about and talk about. Of course, we have to understand that organic farming is very sensitive to place and context, and soil types vary across the world. The climatic conditions vary across the world, and in a lot of places, in a lot of spaces, livestock do have a role in developing and supporting complex agricultural systems. Now, certainly, as I said earlier, we need much more diversity in the types of systems we have, and we need systems to balance. At the moment, the emphasis is often on producing a commodity, producing beef, producing milk, producing eggs, and that mindset needs to be challenged. The organic principles do challenge it, but that challenge still needs to be stronger. So finding the right place and space for livestock within production systems is still really important. And certainly in some areas, the fertility that ruminant livestock provides is very important. And you can perhaps see that there is a role for monogastric livestock in upcycling or recycling byproducts or co-products or products that would otherwise go to waste. I'm sure that in a lot of circumstances, it is possible to design systems which do function without livestock. But perhaps sometimes we need to ask if those systems are optimized in the absence of livestock. So yeah, lots of questions around the place and role of livestock. And in looking at organic systems, I would just encourage people to remember that organic at scale within Europe is quite a recent phenomenon. We have to remember that there have only been harmonized rules for organic in Europe since the early 90s, and livestock production as part of organic farming in Europe has only been harmonized since 2000. So we're still early days and early doors, but this is a time and place for new thinking and better thinking about the way in which we produce our food.
Definitely, people as livestock is a form of new thinking. I didn't expect you to come out with that, so it's a very interesting turn there. Nick, on this topic, I think you'll be really well placed. I mean, Chris has highlighted the need for diversity in systems, as you have as well, and this talk of natural ecosystem regeneration. Is this kind of regeneration possible without animals? I mean, in natural ecosystems, to my knowledge, there are not vegetarian kind of ecosystems. What's your take on this? Are we able to produce in this way without animals, or are animals part of this diversity that you highlighted in your opening remarks?
Thanks. I think that, as Tilly said, we don't necessarily need animals for organic farming, and as several people have said. But is that really the question we need to be asking? The way I see this question, I think we need to really focus on what is the transition that we want fundamentally. And I think most of us would agree it's a transition from industrial monocultures towards highly diverse, sustainable systems that nurture ecosystems, that rehabilitate ecosystems. And in order to do that, the starting point does not necessarily need to be reducing animal numbers. There's a risk, I think, that if we focus disproportionately on animals, and if we talk in generic terms about animal agriculture, we'll miss the bigger point that there are specific industrial livestock systems and industrial cropping systems that are the problem. And any policy approach or any approach we take that is really focusing on reducing animals as the main objectives will have unintended side effects. I think it will end up harming some of the small scale, locally embedded mixed livestock farming systems, perhaps working on marginal land where they're actually using resources fairly efficiently, where they're multifunctional. Livestock don't just produce animal products, they may also produce leather. Certainly in other parts of the world, they're a form of traction. So I think there's just a danger in general when we identify animal agriculture as the problem and kind of pristine ecosystems without animals as the solution. I think we need to keep the focus very clearly on the types of production systems that are problematic. I think if we get the incentives right for all forms of sustainable, diversified production, we will reduce the number of animals. We will reduce the production and consumption of animal foods, but as a function of a transition to sustainable food systems and sustainable diverse diets. If we do it the other way around and aim for the reduction of animals for whichever goal we're looking at, whether it's climate or ecosystem restoration or biodiversity, I think that we may end up firstly with co-option by industry through potentially highly industrial processed substitute products, and we will end up harming the forms of sustainable small-scale livestock farming that are not really the problem here.
And highlighting another point, the dilution aspect there with corporations. I'll come back to that with you in a little bit, but let me turn now to Helen. I mean, what would you respond to Nick's comments there? You know, is there a risk of maybe focusing disproportionately on this, or, you know, is this too simplistic to talk about vegan or animal-free production? Maybe you could respond to what Nick just said then.
Yeah, sure. I think I mean, I broadly agree with what Nick is saying, and I think just to bring in some other points as well, I think it is useful to look at where most of the impacts come from and to really understand why that is the case. So in my talk, I explained about animal agriculture has this kind of disproportionate impact because it uses so much land and because it requires so many crops basically to go into producing those animal products. So I think having that understanding is really useful, and I wouldn't really suggest an alternative to that at this point. But I think going back to the sort of the food system approach is really the key thing in this. So how do we basically design a food system that works and we don't have these really kind of expensive products in the system basically that we don't necessarily need? And I think this is really important, especially when we're looking at ecosystem, not just restoration but also preservation. So for ecosystems to be preserved in their current state requires that we don't actually expand agricultural land, and going forward most of that is expected to come from animal agriculture for more crops mainly. But also if we look at the sort of carbon opportunity costs in our work, it's really the sort of permanent pasture land which is the most the beneficial part of the transition. So I think if we just focus on industrial agriculture and we're looking at crop production mainly, then we're really missing out that kind of bulk of land use, which is where we need to be restoring ecosystems in order to remove those emissions from the atmosphere. So I completely understand the points and I broadly agree, as I said, but I think to take into account what sort of land is needed for which purposes in terms of restoration, then we can't really discount the extensive animal agriculture and only focus on the intensive.
Yeah, definitely. And coming to you now, Tilly, I mean, we've heard again and again from panelists, you know, this need to for complexity. And, you know, Nick highlighted that instead policy is often increasingly moving into this kind of silver bullet, simple solutions. Chris was saying the important role that politicians play here. How can, you know, how can policy move towards this kind of complexity that's needed? We hear all the time holistic, the word holistic in this. And also, I wonder if you can comment on, I mean, you know, these solutions, we've spoken about the urgency of implementing these solutions, but they take time to implement. And I'm wondering your perspective on how policy can kind of, you know, there'll be a longer view on this rather than short-term kind of aims.
Yes, just first of all, to react on your remark that we need to have a holistic view to address food system. So it's really, if you look at sustainability, we have to look at the economic, at the social, at the environmental aspect. If we do not always think and regulate like this, it will not work in the long run. For example, products which are good for the environment need to be produced in an economically viable way and should remain affordable. So it's very linked now. Regarding what is the role of the politics, and also regarding timelines, you all know that we are working now on, I would say, on an old proposal for the common agricultural policy, and on the other hand we have new strategies like the farm to fork strategy, like the biodiversity strategy, like the organic action plan for more organic farming. So in my eyes, if the Commission would have been brave, they would have said, okay, we need to table a new proposal regarding the common agricultural policy. They did not do that. So for me, policy and politicians should at least guarantee that they are coherent in what they are doing. And right now, I see the problem that we have some concrete targets for the next years into the farm to fork strategy, into the biodiversity strategy, to reduce chemicals, to reduce fertilizer, to reduce antimicrobial resistance, and so on and so forth. But if there where we put the money in, and we're speaking here about billions, 270 billions for the next, from 2023 to 2027. So that should have been an instrument, a tool really to address those priorities in order to succeed to this ecological transition. So it's really a missed opportunity now. But what we are insisting on is really that we do a midterm review with this common agricultural policy, which is outdated, which doesn't succeed to make the right paradigm shift we really need in order to achieve our climate targets, but also biodiversity restoration and so on and so forth, so that at least we do a midterm review. So because in the meantime, then this farm to fork strategy, biodiversity strategy, there come legislative texts which are going to be binding. So we need to review this old proposal, I think, as soon as possible, because right now it's definitely not going into the right direction. Even on some points we are going backwards regarding the current situation. So that's like what we do right now. And for me, it's always important that we should be, especially when there is a lot of public money implemented and that the citizens are waiting also and do want to know where does this money goes and what impact has it really on the environment, on the soil, etc. We should have used this tool of the common agricultural policy to more quickly made a roadmap to achieve those targets, which are much more ambitious in the farm to fork strategy and the biodiversity strategy. I don't know if that responded to all your questions or remarks, but
I think it went some way too. It's a big question, so and we'll definitely come back to talking about the CAP reform a little bit later. This, you know, as you said, 270 billion euro policy that has an enormous effect on the ground. But let me pick up on something else you just said there, Tilly, about the need for also economic sustainability in this as well. I mean, perhaps I can turn to you, Chris. You know, we've heard from Helen about our food system being shaped over the past decades by this kind of cheaper food paradigm, and, you know, producing more food at lower cost. Obviously the farm to fork strategy, we've heard about placing an emphasis on organic production, but there's critics that say this will drive up the price of food, and that, you know, sustainable agriculture costs money. How can we balance this kind of economic reality with sustainability? Is this a concern in your opinion in the organic sector?
Yeah, again, this is a really difficult one, but I think that Helen's report deals with this quite well, and, you know, really points out that the affordability of food isn't something that can necessarily be solved by this cheaper food paradigm. You know, people can't afford food for a whole host of reasons. But the downward price pressure is obviously disadvantageous to organic farmers. And, you know, organic farmers and organic farming is taking place in a wider context. You know, to some extent, it is competitive with the current system and the current paradigm. So it is going to take significant policy changes to enable the growth that's envisaged by the farm to fork strategy. You know, Europe has declared its really ambitious target, 25% to organic land. But to get to that, you know, producers are going to have to be able to be confident that they will find markets and they will find returns. And at the moment, the strongest paradigm within the food retail sector does seem to be to focus on cheapness. But at least that's always the headline. You know, there is actually a huge range of diversity in terms of what people can buy and what they do buy. But getting away from this narrative around the price of food being the cost of food is a really important one as well. You know, the price you pay hides a lot of those hidden costs. So trying to make the actual price of food reflect the cost of food, and those costs obviously being the wider environmental and biodiversity costs, is a really important task as well. And again, I think, you know, this comes back down to people understanding what impacts the choices they may have. So if you choose today to buy something that appears to be cheap, then you pay for it in the longer term in other ways.
The price of food not being the cost of food is a very on point there. Let me just quickly come to, I think I could keep asking questions for a long time, but we're running out of time. I'll have a last question for Nick, and then I'll move to the Q&A from the audience. Nick, you talked about this dilution of you know, this use of regenerative agriculture as a term, and maybe this dilution, you know, use maybe from corporations. I guess you're talking kind of about a greenwashing here. This was a concern also we had, you know, originally with the first organic movement. I'm wondering, you know, in your opinion, how you would kind of tackle this kind of problem. And you would be talking about some kind of labeling system. Maybe you could comment on that.
Sure. I think there are so many ways to tackle this. So I will try to propose or discuss something that's maybe talked about a bit less and often overlooked. And I think when we talk about these debates, we are so focused on what can be done within the mainstream retail sector, whether it's voluntary initiatives, labeling, or even regulation of those companies. All of that is crucial. And there's so much that can be done to have stricter criteria and to avoid greenwashing and undermining of organic and other sustainable standards. But I think there's a real opportunity that's being missed to support alternative supply chains. And, you know, before I was talking about agroecological production systems, they can only really come to fruition if there are supply chains to get those products to market, if there are markets where they can get a fair price to support that production. It's not just about price, it's also markets that have the right modalities to procure food from farms that are producing a range of food. And if you look at like the options that those sustainable, diverse farms have right now, it's often fairly limited. It's consumer supported agriculture, CSAs, it's farmers markets sometimes. And I think we need to be massively investing in those kind of solutions. Cooperative owned grocery stores we see springing up around Brussels, other cities around Europe, still confined to wealthier niches, but But I think there's a huge opportunity to really scale out those kind of options. And those, if we really invest in that alternative food system, not only does it bring sustainable, healthy food to more people, but it also applies pressure on the mainstream. Because while those alternatives occupy 2-3% of the market, the mainstream can ignore them. When they get to 15-20% of the market, the mainstream model needs to adapt. Supermarkets will start listening and will start thinking about how they can really fundamentally change and really make the healthy, sustainable products the easiest option for consumers to find, how they can really make sure the most reliable labels are visible, are not undermined by a plethora of other industry-led labels that tend to confuse consumers. So I think when the mainstream sees that people are fed up with it, I think it will change, and it will be a benefit to everyone.
Thank you for that, Nick. I was hoping there'll be a couple of times for a couple of moments for the Q&A session, but I think we will have to move swiftly to the next panel discussion.